So our presentation is going to have two parts today. One, I'm going to be walking through PowerPoint, only about 12 or so slides. I have snippets from the PSPRS consolidated actuarial valuation. It's not going to be employer specific, but it's going to be the big picture tables and stuff that I'm going to talk about that you can go back and look into your evaluations for. And Clark's going to do a demonstration of the modeler tool we have that can help take some of this information, make it real to you all in terms of thinking about how to manage either the unfunded liabilities that you have, or also just managing pension costs. So what do the actuaries do for PSPRS in very simplistic terms, because there's a lot that goes on here? They estimate future cash flow using lots of assumptions about the future, salaries, mortality, those sorts of things. They discount that estimated cash flow back to a present value. They determine the contributions needed to finance that cash flow, assuming certain investments over time. And then the actuarial valuations aggregate all this information at a certain point of time, that's June 30th every calendar year, which is the end of our fiscal year. Tell you the contributions that you need to budget for, what to incorporate in the financial statements for GASB, and how you can manage your pension liabilities. So with that, let's dive into some of these key tables. This is purely the summary, just like it looks like. It's really just a snapshot of your contribution rates, funded status, year-over-year changes. When I used to do plugging in the rates for the state budget, after my first reading of a couple of these valuations, like most people, I figured out what was important to me in my job, pulled out the rates, plugged them in, kind of left it there. But what I would encourage you all to do, and what I've redone since it's coming back to this role, really reading these reports beyond the summary, really diving in, because there's a lot of good information in there that helps explain these changes in trends. And also might generate questions that you have that Clark and I are suited to help answer this. Reasons for change. This is the second table you usually find in the report. It's a really important table that just talks about why from last year to this year is my contribution rate going up for a specific given population. And this box here is going to more or less encapsulate things that appear annually in the actuarial valuation. They won't always be there. Like the actuarial audit, that was something that was done last year. We won't expect to do one every year. But they'll more or less represent the factors that are influencing changes in the contribution rate and funded status. So I'm just going to check through them real quick and just give a brief explainer. Asset experience, which is relative to the assumed earnings rate. What were the investment gains or losses, and how are they impacting the contribution rate? Payroll base, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's the payroll base over which any calculated contributions are spread over. That typically has a fairly significant impact on the rates, the change in rates given here. Liability experience, particularly in the last set of valuations, primarily driven, this increase is primarily driven by increases in salaries relative to expectations. So that's a category that you would find those sort of policy decisions reflected in actuarial reports. Additional contributions in excess of the actuarial determined amount. Assumption method change, this is where you might find changes to the assumptions that the board has approved. One of the assumptions that the board has been changing over the past several years is what's called the payroll assumption. It's how much we expect the payroll base, it's how much the actuaries expect the payroll base to grow in a given year. That's really more meaningful on the unfunded liability side, which I'll get to talk about a little bit more on the assumption slide when I get there, and then Clark will actually show the demonstration onward. But it's an area where you find more changes to assumptions year over year. And then the actuarial audit, this is change methodology, substitute something. Actuarial audit, all other. This is really what it sounds like in financial statements. We usually have a category of all other, and it can be a host of various many other factors that are driving the change. Looking at some past presentations from our actuaries, be things like data errors or data changes. But it could also be there were more disabilities and more experience with disabilities. And the contribution rate changes usually see some impact on funded status. That's not always the case. It wasn't the case with the payroll assumption, because that's not going to affect your overall amount of unfunded liabilities. But if it's something like the assumed rate of return is changing, then you'd see an impact on the funded status. As I went through all these, there's a there's basically a few words I said in various ways, which is relative to assumed earnings rate, salary increases relative to expectations. All this is driven by the actual experience relative to the expectations that the actuaries have in any given year, and assuming all these assumptions about investment income, what your salary increases are, what mortality rates are, what disability rates are. And so I just want to emphasize that phrase because I think it's a really important phrase. Looked at this. It's relative to where they expected things would be when they were looking forward last year.
Fletcher, before you leave that slide, it's important to look at the things that are going on there and what's driving the change. So if you look at the asset experience, a real common thing that as we talk to employers, they think, well, the investment returns are really driving a lot of things. And we know that investment returns are high and low and very volatile back and forth. But look at the relative impact of asset experience relative to the other factors. Not a lot of change coming from the asset experience. That means that the amortization of those gains and losses over a 7-year period of time in a highly volatile market is working pretty well. So that actuarial assumption and methodology that we use to amortize those gains and losses is working relatively well because it's not causing a lot of volatility to the contribution rates, right? So those are important things to understand, but look at the other things that are driving it far more than asset experience. Liability experience, right? So right now, what's the environment we're in? It's pretty competitive to try to be able to keep up with cost of living and to be able to attract and retain police and fire, right? So there's a lot of pay increases going on. Well, when you give those pay increases, what happens? Liability is going to go up. So it's important to really understand some of those drivers, like Fletcher had said. And I just wanted to point out a couple of those, relatively speaking, between like asset experience and the payroll base. One is driving it far more than the other. So people assume that the investment returns are having this huge driver, but we're tracking pretty close over the long haul towards the assumed rate of return. And it isn't a delta, but it really, in the overall scheme of things, isn't the primary driver.
Contribution results, this is another very important part of the actuarial valuation. It's where you're going to find the actual rates that are being calculated that you have to plug in to contribute based on the salary for qualifying employees. This first box is going to be two parts that I just want to point out. It's the normal cost, which is the amount needed to fund the cost of the benefit next year. Then there's the amortization of unfunded liability, which my note's not quite right. I wish it was the amount needed to fund all liabilities for the day, but it's actually the amount needed to fund the amortization payment for all the liabilities that come to pay. So liabilities are amortized over a certain period of time, so they're not all recognized in 1 year that we're going to be paying on. So this isn't all the payment. I mean, if it was just that, it would make life much easier if that's all we had. But that's just the payment of the amortization of unfunded liabilities. Moving on to health, you have the same for health. The consolidated plan, it gets reduced because it's essentially overfunded. That's going to be true with a number of plans. I don't know the exact number, but there'll be a fair number. Then you get the total amount collected and the total rate on payroll. So this total rate is going to be a RAF rate, if you will, on your dollar salary that should be contributing to PSPRS. Then your alternate contribution rate is the same as the amortization of unfunded liability, and that's the payment that comes from those return categories. And that's going to be the same rate between. That's going to be the same as the amortization of unfunded liability. Just real quick on Tier 3, because it's growing population. The normal cost is a little different than Tier 2. Tier 2 is statutorily capped. State law, Tier 3, the normal cost is divided 50-50 between the employee and the employer. So you're going to see different rates under there for tier 3 and tier 2. And just connecting it back to the summary, when you look at the summary, all you're going to see is this one rate up here, the 8.62%. That's not the total actual rate that you contribute on tier 3, because for tier 3, we also spread over, because the way pension reform worked out a few years ago, we also spread over the unfunded liability over the payroll base of those people in tier 3 as well. So this rate is 31.97%. It's going to be the same as the amortization of unfunded liability in the previous slide, the same as the ECR. And that's where you could get the total rate at the bottom there. Liability support. This is where you're going to find some key ratios and metrics that I think a lot of people will talk about with respect to pensions and certainly did in my former roles. First, you have this actuarial present value of benefits. This is something that PSPRS has been including the last 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, and so it's relatively newer in terms of being included in the reports. But what it reflects is all the liabilities accrued today, plus the normal costs for next year, plus the expected future costs of the benefit, discounted to the present. And so it's a metric, if you will, of the totality of not just the past, but also what the normal cost is going to be tomorrow, and then in the future, what those benefit costs are going to be. And I'll talk a little bit when I get to the ratios at the bottom, what the distinctions are, just to think about them in simplistic terms. But this is just, it's one metric of health of the plan. The other one, when looking at actuarially accrued liability, this is all the liabilities accrued as of the valuation date, which again is June 30th of every year. Your actuarial value of assets, that's going to be what gets reported as the actuarial value of assets, different than market value, as we'll talk about next slide, asset support. And then that gets you with your unfunded actuarial liability, which is typically, I'd say, one of the more frequently talked about metrics when you think about what the media writes or what people are looking at. It's not the only metric, it's just one that seems to have been very prevalent out there. And that both of those generate, when you take the assets and you divide, or the liabilities divide the assets, you get the assets divided by the potential liabilities, you get the funded ratios. So we've got these two measures of funding. What's the difference? What matters? It really depends where you are as an employer on the pension journey you're on. The PVB is a better reflection of just the long term of where you're going. The AAL is going to be more a reflection of where you've been and how you're doing with all the liabilities that we've approved today. And they're not, like most financial metrics, not one better than the other. They just present different stories and telling what's going on in terms of the funded status of the plan and where you hope to get to in the future. So if you're very underfunded on the, if you have a lot of unfunded actuarial liability and your AAL ratio is relatively low, that's probably something you're going to want to focus more on than the PVB ratio, because you're trying to play catch up to what's already happening. If you have a very high, relatively high AAL funded ratio, you're going to be wanting to think more about the PVB and how to manage your pension costs and liabilities moving forward, what you can do to plan for that. So they're just two different metrics that can tell a slightly different story on the status of your individual employer. This asset support slide, it's going to show plan investment income that's not specific to the employer, but I'll tie at the end how you can think back to it as an employer. You get, so the first one's just actual investment income, and then the second one's just the expected amount expected to get for immediate recognition, and then the third line is just the gain or loss that gets subject to amortization. So we have a smoothing policy when we have gains, and so what basically that means is that on an actuarial basis, this amount gets smoothed over 7 years, so that the gain isn't all recognized in 1 year, it's spread over a few years. What's the reason for doing that? What reduces volatility in the contribution rates, because you're spreading out gains and losses over set periods of time that you're not all realizing them in 1 year. And so over time, it's going to help reduce that volatility from year to year. And so you can literally take that number, you divide it by 7, and you get up to the sum there, and it just shows how we're smoothing it over these years. This back down here, this column is where you're going to find on an employer basis both the market value and the actuarial value of the assets that you have in the plan. To understand how to tie this to your actuarial value, you basically just take a ratio of your actuarial value out of the total, so you can then apply it to this amortization schedule moving forward, and then realize, oh, next year there's going to be a loss that's going to be recognized. All else being equal, we don't know what other factors might increase or decrease that, and think about how that's going to impact your plan moving forward. And then the other metric on here, your market value of assets, that's going to be more important for your GASB reporting, because for that purpose, you're using the market value of assets and you're comparing that to the actuarial accrued liability instead of the actuarial accrued assets to the actual client. So something to keep in mind. We also publish GASB reports online. That you want to add anything more to that part?
Well, we do publish total GASB reports. Some GASB 68 and GASB 75. GASB 68 is the pension side. GASB 75 is the OPEB, which stands for other post-employment benefits. In our plan's case, it's the health insurance subsidy. So we'll publish a report for both of those. We'll do one for the separate to public safety for the aging plan. We'll call that the non-risk pool. Then we do a report for the risk pool. That's the employers that are basically smaller employers. They excluded 17 employers, and then tribal entities can choose to participate or not. And they're split out into the risk pool, and that's for the tier 3 employers. So it's the same employer, but they'll have two separate employees. And then we'll do the aging plan for the core, and then we'll do the cost sharing for the core, which is administrative office reports and the org plan. So that each individual employer or actuary the GASB report, which will have all the tables and all the schedules, and those are found on the website. So each, if you're an aging plan, you can go to those and get your individual report, and that's for your financial statements, where you have your notes, your pension liability expense. So that's the GASB report.
Yes, sir. And they're a year behind, right?
Yes.
Because of the lag.
So, so we do the measurement basis, right? So the measurement basis for the reports, what we're doing for fiscal year end 23, right? Which was published every year. That's what you're going to use when you do your financial statements for fiscal 24. Otherwise, there's really not enough time to consolidate on information. Yes. So GASB allows measurement data plan, and you can actually mark that trees. AXRS, go back. No, it's just 1 year. So that's what we use. We go back.
Wanted to put in this portion of the actuarial report because it's not going to be directly tied to the specific any of those specific tables in terms of you trace numbers between them, but it's going to inform directional movement liabilities. What do I mean by that? I mean when you look at this back, when you look at the front and say, well, liability experience is increasing, or they're writing about changes in categories like disability. You can go back here and you can start to parse out, okay, well, what's the composition of the employees? Are we getting more tier 3 employees, or not? Our salary increase is greater or lower than expected. The average annual salary increase here is around 10%. What did our actuaries expect there to be? And I'll show you the assumption slide where you can find what the expectations are. But this can help, the other category would be like more or less disability retirees than anticipated. This can help inform the understanding of, well, my contribution rate went up. Why? Well, if you're a smaller employer, you had 1 or 2 people who went on disability and wasn't expected, that's going to increase the contribution rate on all else being equal. So I just want to keep this in mind. It's something we'll look at. Employers ask us, why did this happen? We'll go to the back here and say, well, you know, you had a very large salary increase relative to what we would expect, things like that. This is the part of the assumptions page. There's about 3 pages of assumptions that they publish in each actuarial report. As always, I love telling people, always read the assumptions, always read the footnotes, right? Always understanding what's driving some of these things. These are some of the high-level ones, that just were beginning ones that are pulled out, but they drive a lot of the assumptions and the experience relative to the assumptions is what drives a lot of the changes at any given year. You know, the interest rate, assumed rate of return, if it's lower, it's an increase in present value of liabilities. This is a topic that even trustee Matt brought up. So it's a common topic that we hear out there a lot. We currently have 2 assumed rate of return depending on the tier. It's an active discussion, or it's a discussion right now about how to organize that. And then, you know, with some of our assumptions, it's always the question of, well, this one is too high or too low. Well, just pulling from our most recent ACFR, you know, the 3, 5, and 10-year returns continue to be greater than 7.1%, near the assumed actuarial rate of return. So when you think about these assumptions, these aren't coming out of thin air. They're coming based on experience. And that's true for the other assumptions too, like salary increases. We do experience studies. And so the experience studies compare the assumptions relative to actual experience over given periods of time. And as I was flipping through our last experience studies, you know, over the previous 5 years, they tracked pretty well. Of course, you never know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. We ended in a very high inflationary environment. So there's a lot of competition, people adding a lot of salary increases. So these assumptions are based on actual experience over time, and are informing the modeling of the actuaries too. But I do want to emphasize that they are based on actual experience and not just, you know, made up ideas. Do you have questions, sir?
So the FEMA fire, Maricopa fire,
yes,
that's incorporating municipal as well as special districts.
To my knowledge,
I think so.
Yeah.
Oh. Question.
Oh yeah, the question was, does the I apologize.
My question was the FEMA police, FEMA fire, that incorporates special districts as well as municipal or the special.
And this is another table. There's actually about 5 different metrics that are picking up this table, but I pulled out the one that I just wanted to emphasize for this presentation. And it's under this planned maturity out of risk metrics. And I pulled out this one because this is the funded ratio over time. So when we looked at the unfunded ratio, this one I'm just talking about the actuarial accrued liability to the actual value of assets. You know, you might see a change in one year to the next, and wondering what's going on, what's happening. You know, I thought we were making great progress. And I would encourage you not to just think about a 1-year change, but to look at more of a trend over, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10 years, and see what the overall trend is in funded status. Because it's the funding pension systems is a marathon. It's going to take a long, you know, it's a lot of years that go in. People work for a long time, and we're making a lot of assumptions about the future. And so looking at the funded ratio over time is going to be a better way to say, well, are we on track to be meeting all our obligations? Or are we off track? Rather than just looking at 1 year to the next and drawing conclusions about where you are. Because it can be a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back type of thing. So I want to highlight this. There's a table in that already has 4 years worth. And you can always find other ones back there too to look at the overall trend in funded ratio over time. Some discussions about the actuarial assumptions that are going on, just for everyone's knowledge. I mentioned the payroll growth assumption. Right now, as for the last valuation, the payroll growth assumption for Tier 1 and 2 for PSPRS was at 2%. It's positive for the moment as the board, along with conjunction stakeholders, considers whether to keep boosting that. That would have an impact on the paying down the unfunded liabilities and what that payment will look like. And Bob's going to model how that looks like on a modeler in terms of changing payroll growth assumptions, so you can all visualize it. In court, for those employers with court plans, that is scheduled to go down to 0% over a few more years. But it's an important assumption that the board and the actuaries have decided to reduce over time so that we can make progress on the unfunded liabilities holistically.
And the other one I mentioned that the derived force is to assume rate of return. That there's discussions about how and when and how those rates that it's necessary. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Clark to give a demonstration of the model.
Okay, thanks, Fletcher. That was a real good overview. Was that helpful for you to zero in on some of those concepts and just talk about selected pieces there? Because it's really important to understand that when the actuaries come in, what they're trying to do is, one of the first things they do is they take the census data as of June 30, 23, the date of the valuation, which also coincides with most of your financial statement data, right? And they're going to take that data and the salaries and they're going to project out a cash flow. And they're going to estimate what that's going to be. They don't know how long people are going to live. They don't know when people are going to retire or anything. They're going to do all of those estimates consistent with the assumptions and the things that are going on from the census data and methodologies that are established. And then they're going to take that cash flow and they're going to discount it at the assumed rate of return to the present value. And so that's that present value of benefits. And then they take that present value of benefits and they say, of that future cash flow, how much is earned as of today and how much is going related to future service. So they'll kind of break that down. And that's how you get that AAL. That's what's been earned as of the actuarial valuation date. And that's what you're going to pick up in your financial statements for going forward. And so that's very important to understand what the actuaries are doing. And keep in mind that they're just intended to be directionally correct. The goal is to provide not all the assets that you need as of today. The goal is to ultimately be able to provide the cash flow to be able to make all these payments over a very long period of time. So the actuarial valuation is not intended to be empirically correct because it's based on so many assumptions and estimates and methodologies. But what is important is that you're making the progress that needs to be made to get to ultimately where we need to be. And that is a similar methodology that's going to probably Mark and Harry will talk about, is that they're not trying to earn all the money in this year. They're not trying to beat a benchmark or something by X. They're trying to make sure that they're safeguarding those assets and having the assets where they're going to be available to provide benefits long term. So all of these factors, whether it's the actuaries or the investment strategies, they all work together to accomplish the overall purpose. And that's what's important. And sometimes we get hung up. I can be an anal retentive accountant sometimes and say, well, what about that? That doesn't seem to, maybe tie out exactly right. Or I had more vacancies this year, and that census data was flawed because it was a snapshot in time, and I really had higher or lower salaries during the year than what the actuaries estimated. It's okay. It's just like budget estimates. How many of you make budget estimates at the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year, just 1 year later, you're perfectly correct? How many of you can do it even for a month, let alone a year? Right? So all of these, when we use estimates, we use assumptions, we have to continually update and review those estimates to make sure we're on target to get to where we ultimately want to be. So that's one thing that I want to really emphasize today, that's what the actuaries are trying to do. That's what the investments are trying to do. We're trying to make sure that we're taking care of things over generations of time. Okay? And there's plenty of time to course correct. It happens every year. Now for us, we think a year is a relatively long time, but when you think about a firefighter or a police officer who just started at age 20 or 25, how much longer is it going to be till they retire? How much longer is it going to be until they finally collect their last pension payment? or their beneficiaries collect their last pension payment. Could be 50, 60, 70, 80 years, potentially in the future. So we're talking long periods of time, okay? So here we are with the modeler. An important thing to understand about the modeler is that it is based on the actuarial valuation itself. So the modeler, even though it's a spreadsheet and it does math, just like we all do, it's not going to be any more empirically accurate than the underlying actuarial valuation that it's based on. So it's going to give results consistent with that actuarial valuation. And what is, a lot of those things that the actuaries calculate are locked down so that you can't just mess things up a lot and deviate from the actuarial valuation excessively to where it's not relevant. So what the modeler does, it allows you to change certain variables and to be able to model certain things and see, directionally speaking, what type of an impact could that have over a longer term basis. Does that make sense? So we have here, it defaults actually to the Phoenix Police Department. We'll keep that. Does anybody want to change that? What you do is you click on that and there's a drop down. You can come in and you can change that to something else. Is there anything that anybody wants to see on this list here? What's your number?
Don't know.
I don't know either. I'm sorry. But it is by number, not by alphabetical. But we'll pick on Tucson Fire since, you know, we'll name others hometown here. So we'll pick on Tucson Fire. You can see that that's changed a little bit different now from what it was with Phoenix. And this really goes in and asks you what you want to display to. You could actually go in and change some of these things. You could change it to shorter or longer within a range here, 2022 through 2061. Since the modeler is intended to be longer term, we'll leave it at a fairly long term here. The new hire schedule, we assume that it's a level population growth. That's what the actuaries assume. If you were going to be hiring at a much faster or slower clip than what would just be normal with a level population growth, you could change that a little bit. But you would need to go through, there's an input schedule before. You can say, I'm not going to hire anybody at all. If, for example, you're going through a hiring freeze and there was a 2-year hiring freeze or something extended, you could do that. But that's really not too common. I just wanted to point out that it's there. Valuation, as far as the investment, the assumed rate of return. So you can go in and change that from the current board approved rate for tiers 1 and 2 is 7.2%. You can change that. And one of the things that we'll do here is we'll change that to what? Maybe, Harry, 7%? Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Look at how much that changed everything. You can see that there's a difference. The red line is a little bit higher on the contribution rates, but not tremendously higher, right? So you can change it even to, let's pick another rate, maybe 6.5%. This line 6.8. Is that okay? 6.8. I think I just fat fingered it. That's what it is. 6.8. 6.8 again. So that's a little bit more conservative of a discount rate, right? And it changed things a little bit. But the funded ratio really didn't change much, did it? So again, wanting to emphasize, a lot of people really harp on the unfunded liabilities are created because of investment decisions or things like that. The investments are extremely important. If we did not have the investments, we'd be putting in a whole lot more in contributions. But in the overall scheme of things, whether you use a discount rate of 7 or 7.2 is not as significant as many other factors that go into the rate. But when you give a pay increase of 10% and the actuaries are thinking that you are expecting something like 2%, that's a significant change. And the reason why it's significant is how are the benefits calculated? The average salary times a factor, which is based upon the length of the number of years of service, right? It's a direct factor in calculating what benefit those individuals are going to receive in their retirement. Now, as you do that, when you give that pay increase, it's effective not only for the future going forward, but it's going to affect the average salary for all the years that have been accumulated to date. So if you have somebody who's been working for 20 years and they get a 10% pay bump, that's going to impact that average salary significantly. Well, what happens in some cases, I think City of Phoenix even had some salaries that increased like 30% as they were trying to deal with retention and attraction issues. So when they're averaging something like 30% per year, and they have this huge payroll base, just imagine what that's going to do to increase their liability. Now, they don't have every year like that, but you have 1 year like that, and it's going to make a significant difference. Yes?
So did you say about, I don't know if I was going to mention the growth, but it was about 2%, and that's just applied to...
I picked that number out of the air. Again, that table that it depends upon the position, it depends upon the location, the geographic location, and a lot of that's built upon the actuaries. About every 5 years, they will do an experience study. So they will have their assumptions, and then they actually go out and say, what was actual experience out there? And then they're going to compare that. And then they're going to come back and they're going to make some recommendations to the board, and the board's going to make some decisions about what to do with some of those assumptions, and then they'll make adjustments. But in some cases, it's like, okay, well, we had this huge increase of salaries that are maybe over a 2 or 3 year period of time. But if inflation subsides, when they do the next experience study, they're going to find there's this difference between actual and what they expected. But it could be that going forward, we think that that 2 or 3 year period of time was the aberration. We think going forward, our actuarial estimates are going to be pretty good given the economic data that we're seeing. And so we're not going to change our estimates based on that. It's just like it, you know, budgetarily, right? If you were budgeting for your entity, you had huge cost increases going on, then all of a sudden costs normalize a little bit more. You're probably not going to be as concerned to continue to budget for these huge inflationary increases when that may not be the truth, the facts, or the best estimate going forward. Does that make sense? Good question. So you can model a different interest rate there. You can also model here a different investment experience. So you can actually change the discount rate separate from the investment rate. Now, again, the fact that you can do something, be careful what you do because you start to deviate. One of the fundamental things that most plans are valued at, the assumed rate of return and the discount rate are the same rate. If you start to decouple those, you're going to get more interesting results, and you have to be very careful how you interpret those results. Okay? So you can do it here if you want to get curious and see how those affect things, but be careful how you interpret the outcomes. Okay? Because normally those are going to be connected. So if the board, as they talk about converging the Tier 3 and the Tier 1 and 2 rates for example, if they were going to take the 7.2 and take that down to 7%, well, that's not only just going to be the assumed rate of return, it's also going to be the new discount. So those are pretty much connected. So you can model them differently, but again, you may want to think about that a little bit. So we're going to go, one of the things I always do when I change rates is I always like to look at things one at a time. And I always try to reset them back to what the assumption is here so that we can go through, because sometimes when you have multiple variables going on in your in the calculations here, you can't see what that one factor does versus the current approach. So if you really want to model something, you can say, what would it be if I did this? And I would encourage you to potentially look at them individually. Then if you want to start, because then you can see what type of a difference that one factor makes. Then if you want to model multiple factors collectively, you can go in and build that version and see what it does. But if you put all of the variables in at the first, you're not going to know which variable is driving it more significantly than the others. So one of the things when you are trying to manage things, it's important to know what is impacting it and how much is it impacting. Because sometimes we really get wrapped around the axle of, well, I know the assumed rate of return is having this huge impact, and that's the water cooler talk, and we get caught up in that. But in the reality is when we go in and put it in and try to model it, it's like, well, it's actually very little of the impact. It does have an impact, and over time that grows significantly. But initially, that doesn't really have as much, it doesn't move the needle as much. But other things do. So you can go in, talk about other things. One of the things that Fletcher talked about was the payroll growth assumption. The board is now at 2. Let's just say that we took that immediately down to 0. Well, eliminating that payroll growth assumption over 1 year, that's the phase-in period, that would have a much more dramatic impact on the funded status, but especially on the contribution rates, than a change in the assumed rate of return. Okay? So that's just one distinct factor of being able to show what those things may be. Okay? Now, one of the most valuable tools here in the modeler on this input is this feature right here. This opens up a input screen here. There are some of these others where you can do an input screen as well, by the way. If you click on those, you can do your own input. If you want to model, for example, rates of return, and you want to say it's, well, I think it's going to average about 6.5% for the next 5 years, and then it's going to shift and go up to 7.5%. You can model those types of things over time. But here you have the opportunity to say, okay, if I'm going to put in a bunch of money towards this, and this is in thousands of dollars. So if I go in and I say, I'm going to put in $1 million into this plan here, what is that going to do? And you can see where it starts to make a difference, but I'm putting it in fiscal year 26. Well, that's not going to make a difference in the contribution rate out there for a little while, because fiscal year 26, it would be in the actuarial valuation as of June 30, 26. So it's going to affect down here the contribution rates and things in fiscal year 28. So just know that there's going to be some of this delay in the time, but to really demonstrate, putting in a $1 million there it doesn't do much because why would that be? Relative to the unfunded liability, it's not a lot of dollars. Okay? So we really, to make a difference here, we've got to put in more significant dollars. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a couple of other extra zeros. Now, if you're putting in $100 million, now you're starting to see some significant difference real fast. $1 million didn't really do much. But $100 million starts to make a change, yeah, pretty dramatically. Okay? So you can see that it spikes up in the 1 year when you put in the $100 million, but then all of a sudden the contribution rate starts to drop, and you can see that it starts to deviate over an extended period of time from the line. If you put that in and you did something like, a lot more, put in $200 million, or well, get a little bit more wild and crazy, put in $400 that way. Now all of a sudden you're going to see that, relatively speaking, and did you see the size of the scale had to change on the graph because you bumped it up quite significantly. But that's still, look what happens to the funded status. If I scroll up to that. Funded status almost wiped out most of the unfunded liability because you're now approaching 100% funded status. Right? So those are the things that you can model there. Any questions on that so far? I'm going to go through a few more things real quick and we'll take some questions. This is a page that helps you understand from the current situation with the current assumptions and estimates versus what we're modeling here. And what we did here is we dumped in $400 million. You can see that the unfunded liability in the first year went down significantly from 26 to 27. It went down significantly. So you wiped out most of it with that $400 million payment. Okay? So that's one thing that you can see is you can see what that does to the estimated contribution rates going forward. Okay? Another page here, table 2, it's just excerpts from the actuarial valuation. But it puts them at your fingertips in the modeler because these are sometimes things that you want to refer to very quickly and easily without having to go back and pull up your actuarial valuation. So there are certain key select measures from excerpts from that actuarial valuation there. The debt financing tab was developed because we had some financial advisors and employers come to us and say, well, we want to be able to model things and we want to be able to compare that to what a debt service would be like if we wanted to issue financing to take care of some of this. So that was put together. So this is a projection of contributions that can be made that's helpful to them to compare cash flows under a debt service versus cash flows if you didn't pay off any unfunded liability. And then these other two tabs deal with the funding policy. You can see, the relative measures, green or red, on whether or not that's being met. The one that is not being met is the current 5-year cumulative gain or loss. Is currently about 8.2%, I believe, 8.1%. And that's a little bit over what the actuaries would like it to see over a 5-year average percent of time. So the reason why that's important is that cumulative gain or loss, if you get more volatile, then that becomes harder to be able to manage. And so that's a measure of volatility on those gains and losses that are there. So that's a quick overview of the modeler. Probably one of the things before we take questions and see if there's anything, if you've got questions, if you want to just use a sounding board, Fletcher and I are available to help you and talk through things with you. Just feel free to pick up the phone, send us an email, whatever you want to do to be able to do that. You're very, very brave. I can tell because you attended this session right after lunch. So, any questions that you got for us? This must be the question.
Can you show us how to access the modeler? Is it through the employer portal or? Is
No,
it
the modeler is, we send that out. If you want to sign up for the modeler, it's proprietary to Foster & Foster. They developed it, so we don't make it publicly available, but we make it available to all employers who want to see the model. There's a guide, by the way, that's very, very important too, because it goes through and explains how the modeler works, how the drop-downs work, how all those things work. But if you ever have any questions, feel free to contact us. But you can either send me an email, send Christian an email. You can put on the list to make sure that you get the model. And the modelers are in the final stages of being finalized, so they're going to be distributed shortly. So this is your opportunity to get on the list so that you'll get it the first time. But even if you don't get it, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you a copy of your modeler.
You have your email address?
Yes.
You have your email address?
C. Partridge, as in the pear tree in the family, at PSPRS.com.
What does the Tier 3 legacy cost for Tier 1, Tier 2?
When there's no more Tier 1 and 2 liability. So, for example, it also runs out if you become 100% funded because there's no more unfunded liability to be amortized. So once you get to be 100% funded, that Tier 3 legacy payment goes away. Because it's tied, what the actuaries do is they take the unfunded liability and they spread it across the entire payroll base, whether it's Tier 1 and 2 or Tier 3. That way it's smooth over that. So if you have volatility between Tiers 1 and 2 or Tiers 3, it smooths that out so that it doesn't get skewed by just, because if you all of a sudden had Tiers 1 and 2 shrink, well then your contribution rate is going to go up significantly. But by spreading it over that broader population, you reduce volatility in the contribution rate for that legacy. Good questions. Anything else? One more question, we good? We don't want to take away from Harry and Mark. We know that we're just the warm-up group. They're the stars of the show that you came to see.
In the GASB 68 report compared to the actuarial valuation report, the unfunded liabilities have not matched. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the biggest reason why is because there's a year lag. Number one reason that you're going to find, because the actuarial valuations are tied to the previous year. So what you've got in the GASB reports that are coming out, that came out last year for your financial statements, were based on June 30, 22 GASB reports. So the GASB reports that are going to be coming out in related to 23 are going to be the next GASB reports that come out after these actuarial evaluations being out in December. So that's the primary reason. Second reason is the GASB reports use the market value of assets, not the actuarial value of assets. So that's why Fletcher went through that difference between the market value and the actuarial value and those differences. And that's being amortized over a 7-year period of time. But if you want, you can shoot us an email and we can answer your question, or John can answer your question as well. Because they produce the GASB reports and things like that. But we can get you that information and things. But those are the two primary reasons. The first one is the 1-year delay. Then the second primary one is the difference in assets. Because on a financial statement basis, the market value of assets, that's the assets you have as of your balance sheet date, and as of the valuation date. Whereas the actuarial value of assets is that we're amortizing the difference between those over a 7-year period of time. And so it takes 7 years to move through the value of that snake. If everything else were equal and you didn't have any more deviations in between everything earned exactly 7.2% going forward for the next 7 years, those would merge. And they'd be the exact same number. But because they're different, and they always probably will be, because market value is going up and down and we're smoothing that out, we're chasing our tail for 7 years, there's going to be that difference. Good questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll turn the floor over to Mark and Eric.